All right, so today we're putting on our detective hats. We're about to tackle one of the biggest mysteries out there, the story of ancient India. We're going to sift through clues from buried cities, decode languages that were lost for centuries, and even cross-examine ancient travelers. So, let's get started.
Really think about it for a second. This is the ultimate cold case, right? There are no photos, no videos, and the clues are scattered, broken, and sometimes written in scripts we couldn't even read until pretty recently. So how on earth do we piece together a reliable picture of the past from all that? Well, that's the puzzle we're going to solve today.
You know, the first thing to get our heads around is that history isn't just a list of facts you find in a book. It's something that has to be actively built. It's a process, a science really, called historical construction. It's all about taking these scattered clues, a broken pot here, an ancient text there, and carefully assembling them into a story that actually makes sense based on the evidence. So here's our game plan for this investigation. We'll start by digging up the physical clues, the forensic evidence, you could say. Then we'll move on to decoding the messages they left behind in their writing. After that, we'll see how a good historian cross-references everything with outside sources before finally putting it all together to build the case. Okay, first up, the physical stuff. This is the forensic evidence of history. These are the things you can actually touch, the tools they used, the pottery they ate from, the ruins of their cities. For any historian, this is the most direct, tangible link we have to how people actually lived.
And the science that uncovers all this is, of course, archaeology. What's really interesting is that so much of ancient India is buried under these things called mounds. They just look like hills, but they're actually the layered remains of ancient towns, built one on top of the other over centuries. Archaeologists dig into these mounds layer by layer, reading them like pages in a history book. And they have two main ways of doing this. A vertical dig is like drilling down through time. It shows you the whole sequence of cultures, one after another, from newest to oldest. But a horizontal dig, that's like pausing time. You uncover an entire layer to get a complete snapshot of what life was like in that one specific period.
So you find a piece of bone or wood. How do you know how old it is? Well, that's where some brilliant science comes in, specifically radiocarbon dating. You can think of it like a natural molecular clock. See, every living thing on Earth absorbs a tiny bit of radioactive carbon-14. When it dies, it stops absorbing, and that C14 starts to decay at a perfectly predictable rate. So by measuring how much is left, scientists can calculate its age, and it's incredibly accurate. Now let's talk about another piece of physical evidence that's just amazing: coins. You might just think of them as old money, but for a historian, a single coin is a tiny, information-packed time capsule. The name on it tells you who was king. Where you find it helps you map the borders of their empire. The metal, gold, silver, copper, tells you about the economy. And the little symbols and pictures, they give you clues about their art and their religion. It's incredible.
And this chart really tells a powerful economic story. Just look at those high bars for the post-Maurya and Gupta periods. The sheer number of coins found, especially the gold ones, tells us that trade was booming, the economy was thriving. But then, look at that dramatic drop in the post-Gupta period. The evidence right here in the coins suggests a pretty major economic slump. They're literally telling a story of boom and bust.
Okay, so we've looked at the physical clues. Now let's turn to the messages, the actual words the people of ancient India left behind. And this is where the detective work gets really tricky, because deciphering these texts comes with a whole new set of challenges.
We basically have two main types of written evidence. On one hand, you've got inscriptions, things carved on stone or metal. Think of these like official press releases. They're usually dated, factual, and meant to last forever. But on the other hand, you have literary sources, religious texts, epics, poems, written on fragile stuff like birch bark. These are more like living documents, added to and edited by many people over centuries. They're incredibly rich, but way more complex to interpret.
And the story of writing itself is just wild. The very first script from the Harappan civilization is still a complete mystery. To this day, no one has been able to decipher it. Then there's this huge gap, more than 1,000 years, before we see new scripts like Brahmi pop up. But even then, for centuries, modern historians couldn't read them either. An entire chapter of history was locked away until a massive breakthrough in the 1800s.
And this was that breakthrough moment. All across India, there are these pillars and rocks covered in writing by the great emperor Ashoka. For centuries, nobody knew what they said. Then, in 1837, a civil servant named James Prinsep finally cracked the code. And just like that, a huge part of India's history that had been silent for millennia could speak again. It was an absolute game changer.
Now, literary texts have their own puzzle. Take the Mahabharata. It didn't just appear as the gigantic book we know today. It started as a much, much smaller story, and over hundreds of years, it grew as people added new sections and teachings. So for a historian, you can't just read it as a single book from one moment in time. You have to kind of excavate the text itself, peeling back its layers, just like an archaeological mound.
Okay, so we've got our physical evidence and we've got our written texts. But any good detective knows you can't just rely on one or two sources. The next crucial step is corroboration. You've got to check your findings against independent witnesses to see if the stories match up.
And this is where accounts from foreigners are worth their weight in gold. We have Greek writers like Megasthenes who gave us an outsider's view of the Mauryan court. Get this, the entire story of Alexander the Great's invasion of India comes to us from Greek sources. It's barely mentioned in Indian texts. Then you have Roman authors detailing trade and Chinese Buddhist pilgrims who wrote amazing travel diaries. These accounts are like our third-party witnesses.
But corroboration also comes from some surprising places, like modern science. An ancient text might talk about what crops people grew. Well, scientists can analyze ancient pollen trapped in layers of soil and tell us exactly what was being grown and when. Sometimes clues even come from the present day, by studying the lives of people in remote villages whose traditions might echo ancient practices.
So we've gathered our forensic evidence, we've deciphered the messages, and we've cross-referenced everything with our witnesses. Now comes the final, most important step, putting it all together and actually constructing the history, building the case.
And first, let's bust a pretty common myth. You sometimes hear that ancient Indians didn't have a sense of history, but the evidence just doesn't support that. They created specific eras, like calendars to date events, and they wrote biographies, called charitas, about their kings. They were absolutely paying attention to and recording their past.
So, when a historian builds the final story, how do they do it? They have to weigh the evidence. Look at this. Archaeology and inscriptions are usually seen as highly reliable for hard facts and dates because they're hard to change. But literary texts, while they're full of amazing cultural information, have a variable reliability because they were often edited and tend to mix history with mythology. The historian's job is to balance all of this with a critical eye. Here is a perfect real-world example of this in action. The Puranas, which are ancient literary texts, might suggest that a very important event happened around 2000 BC. But when archaeologists actually dig at the site mentioned in the texts, they find no evidence of anyone living there that far back. The physical evidence, or lack of it, directly challenges the timeline in the literary source. This is exactly how historical knowledge gets tested and refined.
And that, right there, is the crucial point of all this. History, especially ancient history, isn't some fixed story that you just read and memorize. It is a meticulous, critical reconstruction. It's about taking every single shred of evidence, a coin, an inscription, a line from a poem, and carefully weighing it against everything else to build the most accurate picture of the past possible.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Fast forward thousands of years into the future. Imagine historians then trying to figure us out. What will they make of our plastic waste, our crumbling cities, our billions of corrupted digital files? What kind of story will our broken clues tell them about who we were? It's kind of a wild thought, isn't it?